"You're getting too old to keep this house, Mom," my son Leo said, his voice trying for gentle but landing on impatient. My fingers went white around the handle of my teacup, the porcelain suddenly feeling fragile, as if it might shatter under the pressure. The warmth of the tea didn't reach the cold that was beginning to bloom in my chest. There it was, the sentence I had been dreading without knowing I was dreading it. My son, my Leo. His words hung in the quiet air of my living room, displacing the scent of old books and dried lavender that had been my comfort for 40 years. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 72 years old. For most of those years, I thought I understood the value of things. But as I looked at my son, at the handsome stranger wearing his face, I realized I had been using the wrong ledger. If he only knew what he was so casually trying to discard. If he and his wife, sitting beside him with her predatory stillness, had any idea what this house, what I, truly represented, to understand why his words felt less like a suggestion and more like a verdict, you have to know who I really am. And to know that, you have to know about Robert. Robert was my husband. He was a history professor at the university, a man who seemed to have a permanent, faint dusting of chalk on the cuffs of his tweed jackets. He smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, a scent I can still conjure if I close my eyes tight enough. To the world, and even to our son, Robert was a quiet academic, a man more comfortable with dusty maps and forgotten treaties than with the frantic hum of the modern world. He called investing his hobby, the way other men might talk about fishing or building model ships. In the evenings, after grading papers, he would sit in his worn leather armchair, the one by the window with the arm so scuffed and softened from his elbow it looked like a patch of suede. He'd have a stack of obscure financial journals next to him, publications with names like the Analyst's Quarterly and the Journal of Portfolio Management. He wasn't gambling, he was studying. He was a historian, and he believed that everything, even the stock market, moved in cycles, in patterns that could be read like a text if you were patient enough. "We're planting trees, Ellie," he'd say, tapping a page with the stem of his pipe, "for a future we might not see, for a shade we might one day need." I trusted him. I didn't need to understand the specifics. I understood the man. His integrity was the bedrock of my world. We bought this house with the money from his first book, a dense and brilliant volume on the economic policies of the Hanseatic League that sold, I think, 700 copies. It was more than enough for us. It was a simple, sturdy house on a street lined with oak trees, with a porch that creaked and a garden in the back where the soil was rich and dark. It was the house where we brought Leo home from the hospital, a tiny squirming bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. I remember Robert standing in the doorway of the nursery, a room we'd painted the color of a robin's egg, just watching him sleep. The look on his face was one of profound, terrified wonder. This house is where Leo took his first steps, his small, chubby hand gripping my finger as he wobbled across the living room rug. It's where he built forts out of blankets and dining room chairs, and where one summer afternoon he ran inside, face flushed with excitement, holding a wriggling earthworm in his cupped hands as if it were a priceless treasure. "For your garden, Mom," he had shouted, his gap-toothed smile the brightest thing I had ever seen. The rooms of this house are layered with these memories, strata of laughter and tears and quiet moments that make up a life. They are baked into the walls, settled in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. It isn't just wood and plaster, it's a repository of love. Leo was a good boy, a kind boy. He had Robert's thoughtful eyes, but my softer heart. He was easily bruised, easily swayed. He wanted so desperately to please everyone, which is a dangerous trait in a world full of people who want to be pleased. Then, in his last year of college, he met Charlotte. The first time he brought her home, the house seemed to shrink. Charlotte was polished. That's the only word for it. She was sleek and smooth, from her perfectly straight hair to her manicured nails to the cool, appraising glance she gave everything. She moved through my home not like a guest, but like an inspector. Her first words upon entering the kitchen were not, "Thank you for having me," but a long, drawn out "Oh," as she took in my mismatched collection of mugs. That night at dinner, I used my wedding china, the set my mother had given me, with its delicate pattern of bluebells. Charlotte picked up her fork and said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, "Your china is so charmingly vintage, Eleanor. It's brave of you to still use it." Brave. As if I were fending off a wild animal by serving pot roast on a plate from 1975. There it was, the unique condescension that would become her signature, a compliment shaped like a kindness but functioning as a tiny poisoned dart. It was my first lesson in her language. I learned that cozy meant small and outdated. Authentic meant old and worthless. Refreshingly unconcerned with fashion meant you looked shabby. She came from a background of painful, sharp-edged poverty. I learned this later, in a rare moment of vena veritas, when she spoke of watching her own mother be humiliated for not having the right clothes, the right address. Her father had left them for a woman with a bigger house and a newer car. Charlotte, I realized, wasn't just performing wealth. She was building a fortress against the memory of that shame. And she saw my quiet, contented life not as a choice, but as the very thing she had spent her entire existence trying to escape. She saw weakness where I had chosen peace. The financial ledger, as I came to think of it, began the year they got married. They wanted a proper wedding, a phrase that belonged entirely to Charlotte. Not at the courthouse, not in my garden, but at a country club with valet parking and swans on a man-made lake. The cost was $50,000. "It's an investment in our future, Mom," Leo had said, parroting a line I was certain he'd heard from his fiancée. "The contacts we'll make." I took the money from a series of bonds Robert had bought in the 80s, bonds labeled Ellie's Rainy Day. I remember the crispness of the cashier's check, the finality of it. It was raining that day, a soft, miserable drizzle. The irony was not lost on me. 2 years later, they wanted to buy a condominium, a sleek glass-walled box in a new downtown building called the Lux. They didn't have the down payment. Charlotte explained it to me over lunch at a restaurant where the water glasses were taller than my head. "Eleanor, you have to understand real estate. It's about leverage. We need to get into the market now or we'll be priced out forever." Leo just nodded, swirling his iced tea. The down payment was $150,000. That was the exact amount of Robert's life insurance policy. I can still hear the voice of the kind, balding insurance agent who had come to the house after the funeral. "This is for your peace of mind, Mrs. Vance," he had said, patting my hand. "Robert wanted to make sure you would never have to worry." I wrote the check. My peace of mind felt like a small price to pay for my son's happiness, or so I told myself. The check cleared, and they moved into their glass box in the sky. Then came Leo's startup. It was an app, something to do with curating artisanal coffee experiences. It was Charlotte's idea, a way for Leo to have a career that sounded impressive at dinner parties. It required $75,000 in seed money. "All jobs are dignified, of course," Charlotte had said to me one afternoon, "but Leo is meant for more than just a 9 to 5. He has vision." To get that money, I sold a small parcel of undeveloped land Robert had bought decades ago in a county that was, at the time, nothing but farmland. He'd paid $4,000 for it. He said it had good bones. The sale brought in just over what they needed. The startup failed in 6 months. The money was gone. Over the years, there were other things. A $20,000 loan to consolidate Charlotte's credit card debt, which she referred to as a minor cash flow issue. $10,000 for a new car when their lease was up. $5,000 here, $2,000 there. Each request was wrapped in the language of crisis and opportunity, of love and obligation. Each time I gave in. Because that's what a mother does, isn't it? You give. You empty your pockets, your savings, your future to pave a smoother road for your child. The grand total I calculated one sleepless night was $322,000, not including the smaller forgotten amounts. My what if fund. What if the roof leaks? What if the car dies for good? What if I get sick? All my what ifs had been sacrificed for their nows. Robert had been gone for 10 years. He died quietly, in his sleep, in our bed. The night before, he had been weaker than usual. He'd asked me to sit with him. He took my hand, his own feeling papery and cool. The blue folder, Ellie, he'd whispered, his voice raspy. In the desk when you need it, not before. Davies knows. He gave me a small, ornate brass key that belonged to the roll-top desk in his study, a piece of furniture he rarely used. I thought it was the morphine talking, a fragment of a dream. I put the key in my jewelry box and tried to forget. I didn't want to think about a time when I might need it. And now, here we were, back in the present. Leo and Charlotte sat on my sofa, the one Robert and I had picked out together. The space between us felt vast, a chasm that had opened up without a sound. The scent of Charlotte's perfume, something sharp and expensive that smelled like sandalwood and ambition, was an invasion. It was trying to colonize the familiar air of my home. It's about asset management, Eleanor, Charlotte said, her voice smooth and reasonable. She had a way of speaking that made you feel like a fool for not seeing her impeccable logic. This house is just sitting here. It's dead money. The property taxes alone are a significant drain. We worry about you, Mom, Leo chimed in, his gaze fixed on a spot on the rug. He couldn't look at me. All alone here, the stairs. What if you fell? His concern was a flimsy costume for the greed I could now see so clearly. It was Charlotte's greed, but he was wearing it. She slid a glossy pamphlet across the coffee table. It skated over the wood and stopped just before my teacup. The title was printed in a soft, looping font, Silver Blossoms Senior Living. The cover featured a stock photograph of a woman with perfectly coiffed white hair, laughing as she played chess with a handsome silver-haired man. Her eyes were bright and completely empty. There was a watercolor rose in the corner of the page. My breath caught. The pamphlet slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor. The rose on the cover seemed to suddenly look like a wound, a splash of blood on the pristine white. A stone formed behind my sternum, heavy and immovable. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a plan. They had researched facilities. They had brochures. This wasn't an idea. It was a project they had been working on. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and I saw a stranger, the boy who brought me worms, the teenager who I taught to drive, the young man who cried on my shoulder after his first heartbreak. He was gone. In his place was this hollowed-out man, his spine removed and replaced by his wife's ambition. We could invest the equity, Charlotte was saying, her voice a relentless, soothing drone. It would generate a comfortable monthly stipend for you. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. We'd handle everything. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, the cold spreading from my chest out to my fingertips. I felt ancient, not in years, but in the way a mountain is ancient, worn down by a relentless, patient erosion. Finally, I found my voice. It was a thin, reedy thing I didn't recognize. I see. They took my silence for acquiescence. Leo visibly relaxed, a wave of relief washing over his face. Charlotte's smile became genuine for the first time. She had won. We knew you'd understand, Mom, Leo said, standing up. It's for the best. They left. I listened to their footsteps on the porch, the sound of their expensive car starting. And then the silence they left behind. It was a different kind of silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. The house, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. They were trying to seal me inside. I sat there for a long time, watching the afternoon light slant across the room, watching my cup of tea go cold. Something inside me, Something I thought was soft and maternal began to harden. It cooled and compressed, turning from a molten core of grief into something sharp and clear and hard as a diamond. That evening, I walked into Robert's study. The room was just as he'd left it. His books were on the shelves, his pipe was in its stand. I went to my jewelry box and took out the small brass key. My hand was perfectly steady. The key felt cool and solid in my palm. I went to the old roll-top desk, a piece I had always found too ornate, too fussy. I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a small, satisfying click. I rolled back the wooden cover. The desk was empty except for a single, heavy, sealed manila folder. It was a deep royal blue. Next to it lay a single, crisp business card. It read, Davies and Associates, LLP Estates and Trusts, A. J. Davies, Senior Partner, and underneath a phone number. Robert's words echoed in my mind. When you need it. Not before. Davies knows. I picked up the folder. It was heavy, substantial. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just sat there in Robert's chair, holding the blue folder in my lap, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting out the seconds of my old life and the first few moments of my new one. I had what I needed. The next morning I made the call. The air in the house felt different, charged with purpose. A woman with a calm, professional voice answered, Davies and Associates. I'd like to speak with Mr. A. J. Davies, I said, my own voice firmer than it had been in years. My name is Eleanor Vance. There was a brief pause, a rustle of papers. Of course, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Davies has been expecting your call. Please hold. A moment later, a man's voice, warm and deep, came on the line. Eleanor, it's Arthur Davies. I was Robert's lawyer and his friend. I'm so glad you've called. There was no surprise in his voice, only a quiet readiness. I've been waiting, he said. And I knew he didn't just mean for the past 5 minutes. His office was downtown in one of the old, dignified stone buildings that Charlotte would have called a teardown. The air inside smelled of rich leather, strong coffee, and the sweet, dusty scent of old paper. It was the smell of Robert's study, amplified. Mr. Davies was a tall man in his late 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a full head of silver hair. He didn't shake my hand. He took it in both of his, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt deeply reassuring. Eleanor, he said, leading me to a comfortable leather chair opposite his enormous mahogany desk. Robert told me this day might come. He hoped it wouldn't, but he was a historian. He believed in preparing for every eventuality. I placed the blue folder on his desk. He told me to call you when I needed to. Mr. Davies nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. He slid the folder toward him but didn't open it. Before we get into this, he said, leaning forward, tell me what happened. And so I told him. I told him everything. About Leo and Charlotte, the request for money, the condescending remarks, the cozy little house, and finally the Silver Blossoms pamphlet. I spoke in a low, steady voice, laying out the facts as if I were a witness at an inquest. When I finished, the silence in the room was profound. Mr. Davies had taken off his glasses and was polishing them with a handkerchief, his gaze fixed on the folder. He put his glasses back on and looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, compassionate anger. My own mother, he said, his voice quiet, was a seamstress. She could stretch $1 into a quilt. People saw the beautiful quilt, Eleanor. They never saw the late nights, the pricked fingers, the magic it took to create it. They just saw something warm and useful that they wanted. He paused. Robert saw your magic, and he made sure it was protected. With that, he untied the string on the blue folder and opened it. He turned it around so I could see. It wasn't one document, it was a sheaf of them, an inch thick, all neatly tabbed. There were stock certificates, brokerage statements, property deeds, and trust agreements. My eyes scanned the pages, but the numbers were nonsensical. They swam before my eyes, long strings of zeros that my mind refused to process. Robert was more than a hobbyist, Eleanor, Mr. Davies said softly. He was a prodigy. He started with his first teaching paycheck in 1973. He invested in a little company that was trying to make personal computers. He bought stock in another that was laying fiber optic cables when most people didn't even know what that was. He never sold. He just accumulated. He read the patterns. He saw the future. He slid a summary statement to the top. I stared at the number at the bottom of the page. It had 8 figures. 8. My hand began to tremble, a tremor that started in my fingers and worked its way up my arm. I felt a wave of dizziness, as if the room were tilting. Breathe, Eleanor, Mr. Davies said, his voice a calm anchor. He got up and came back with a glass of water, pressing it into my hands. It's a shock, I know. I took a sip. The water was cool. I don't understand, I whispered. We lived so simply. That was the point, he said, returning to his chair. Robert hated what money did to people, the performance of it. He said wealth should be a fortress, not a parade. He built this for you, a fortress. He then tapped a stack of deeds. He also bought property, quietly, over decades. Small apartment buildings in up-and-coming neighborhoods. He pulled one deed from the stack and laid it on top. My eyes focused on the name of the holding corporation and then on the property address listed below it. 1400 Skyline Drive, The Lux. The glass of water nearly slipped from my grasp. No, I breathed. Yes, Mr. Davies said, his voice gentle but firm. You own the building your son and his wife live in. You are, for all intents and purposes, their landlord. The entire estate is held in a revocable trust, the Vance Family Trust. You are the sole trustee and beneficiary. You have absolute control. I stared at the deed, at the cold, hard legal truth of it. I owned their glass box in the sky. I owned the ground beneath their feet. The irony was so immense, so staggering, it was almost comical. A laugh, a strange, hysterical bubble of it rose in my throat, and I had to choke it back down. The dizziness was replaced by a cold, thrilling clarity. The fortress Robert had built was not just for my protection. It was also a weapon. Over the next week, my life became a series of quiet, decisive actions. It felt like waking from a long, slow dream. Mr. Davies guided me through the necessary steps. First, we changed the locks on my house. The locksmith was a young man with grease under his fingernails and kind, perceptive eyes. As he fitted the new deadbolt, he said, You know, a key only works if the lock accepts it, ma'am. Some people think they have the key to your life, but you're the only one who can change the lock. I paid him in cash and gave him a $100 tip. The look on his face was worth every penny. Next, I went to a new bank, one where I was not Leo's mother, but Mrs. Eleanor Vance. I opened a new set of accounts under my name alone, linked to the trust. I sat with a polite young woman who didn't call my house cozy. She called me ma'am and showed me how to use the online banking portal. It was empowering. Then I instructed Mr. Davies to halt the automatic monthly transfer of $5,000 I had been sending to Leo and Charlotte's account for the past 3 years. A little something to help with their expenses, as I had foolishly called it. My first small act of personal rebellion was buying an orchid. Not a simple one, but a ridiculously extravagant, multi-stemmed phalaenopsis with blossoms the color of a deep sunset. It cost more than my weekly grocery budget for a month. Charlotte had once pointed one out in a floral shop window and sighed about how prohibitively expensive they were. I brought it home, placed it on my dining room windowsill, and felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. It was a beautiful living thing that was entirely mine. The first counterattack came 3 days later. My phone rang. It was Leo. Mom, he said, his voice tight with irritation. The monthly transfer didn't come through. Did you forget? I took a breath. No, Leo, I said. my voice calm and even. I didn't forget. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his incredulous breathing. What do you mean you didn't forget? Is there a problem with the bank? No, I said. There is no problem with the bank. Another silence, this one heavier, charged with dawning outrage. Mom, what is going on? Charlotte and I count on that money. I know, I said. And then I hung up. I placed the phone back in its cradle, my hand perfectly steady. The second escalation was more vicious. A week later, a thick envelope arrived by courier. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter, written in dense legalese, that spoke of their deep concern for my well-being and cognitive state, and suggested that it might be in my best interest to consent to a voluntary competency evaluation. It was a threat cloaked in the language of care. They were trying to declare me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs and my own house. I didn't even feel a flicker of fear. I simply drove the letter to Mr. Davies's office. He read it, his lips tightening into a thin, hard line. Amateurs, he muttered. He dictated a response to his assistant right there in front of me. It was a masterpiece of legal threat, referencing statutes on elder abuse, financial exploitation, and malicious litigation. It ended with the sentence, "Be advised that our client, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, is the sole trustee and principal of the Vance Family Trust, which holds, among other assets, title to the property at 1400 Skyline Drive. We trust you will advise your clients of the precariousness of their position." He sent it via courier that same afternoon. We heard nothing further from that particular law firm. Then the invitation arrived. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the letters embossed in gold. Charlotte and Leo Vance invite you to celebrate Leo's promotion to Vice President of Strategy. It was to be held at their condominium. A party, of course. A performance for their friends, for Leo's new boss, for the world they were so desperate to impress. I looked at the RSVP card. Without a moment's hesitation, I ticked the box next to "Will attend," placed it in the stamped self-addressed envelope, and dropped it in the mail. The stage was set. The night of the party, a profound stillness settled over my house. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out Sama's life for 40 years. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, not getting ready, just looking. I had chosen my outfit hours ago. A simple charcoal gray sheath dress I'd owned for 20 years, a single strand of pearls Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary, and my sensible, low-heeled black shoes. I looked like what I was, a widow on a fixed income. I looked exactly as they expected me to look. A wave of grief, sharp and unexpected, washed over me. I saw my reflection, and for a moment I didn't see a woman preparing for battle. I saw a lonely old woman who was about to shatter what was left of her family. I walked into the living room and picked up the silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was Leo, age 7, on the beach, squinting into the sun, his hair a wild tangle, his gap-toothed smile radiating pure, uncomplicated joy. I remembered the feeling of his small, sandy hand in mine. I remembered the weight of his sleeping head on my shoulder on the drive home, the sweet, milky smell of him. Where did that boy go? The question hung in the quiet room. Was this vengeance? Was I being as cruel as they were? The thought made me feel hollow. I sank into Robert's armchair, the worn leather cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and saw Charlotte's perfectly polished face, her smile that never reached her eyes. I heard her voice, dripping with false sympathy. Your home is so cozy. I heard Leo's voice, impatient and dismissive. You're getting too old to keep this house, Mom. The grief receded and the cold, hard resolve returned. This wasn't about vengeance. Vengeance is a hot, messy emotion. This was about truth. It was about balance. It was about restoring a ledger that had been manipulated for far too long. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my generosity for foolishness. They had tried to erase me, to pack me away in a box like an old unwanted heirloom. They needed to understand that I was not an asset to be liquidated. I was the source. I stood up. I went to the dining room and looked at the extravagant orchid on the windowsill, its blossoms a defiant slash of color against the dark night. I went to Robert's study and picked up the blue folder. It felt heavy in my hands, a tangible weight of history and power. I slipped it into my old canvas tote bag, the one with the faded museum logo from a trip we'd taken the year Leo was born. My armor wasn't a sequined dress. It was a 20-year-old tote bag filled with the truth. I picked up my keys from the hall table and walked out the door, pulling it shut behind me. The click of the new deadbolt was a solid, definitive sound. The Lux was aptly named. It gleamed. The lobby was a cavern of white marble and chrome, with a doorman who looked more like a Secret Service agent. He'd never so much as glanced at me on my previous visits, when I'd come bearing Tupperware containers of homemade soup. Tonight, as I walked in, he gave me a crisp, respectful nod. Perhaps Mr. Davies's letter had been circulated. The party was on the penthouse level in Leo and Charlotte's apartment. The elevator doors opened onto a wave of noise, loud music, shrill laughter, the clinking of glasses. The air smelled of money, expensive perfume, and something being pan-seared, probably scallops. The apartment, which I had only seen in daylight, was transformed. It was all hard surfaces and reflective angles, filled with people who were as sleek and polished as their surroundings. Charlotte, a shimmering column of silver sequins, was holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Leo stood beside her, looking stiff and uncomfortable in a suit that was a little too tight in the shoulders. He was laughing, but his eyes were darting around the room, anxious. Charlotte spotted me. For a split second, a flicker of annoyance crossed her face before it was replaced by a wide, brilliant smile. She glided toward me, her hand outstretched. "Eleanor, we are so glad you could make it." Her hand was cold, her grip briefly tight. "Let me get you a drink. We'll find you a quiet corner to sit down. You must be tired." It was the same old script. Marginalize, infantilize, tuck away. "I'm fine right here. Thank you, Charlotte," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I didn't move. I let my old canvas tote bag slide from my shoulder and held it in my hand. A few people nearby glanced at it, then at my simple dress, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disdain. I was a sparrow that had wandered into a flock of peacocks. Charlotte's smile tightened. "Of course," she said, and glided away to greet someone more important. For the next hour I stood quietly, a ghost at the feast. I watched them. I watched my son accept congratulations, his face flushed with a mixture of pride and imposter syndrome. I watched his wife network, touching arms, laughing at jokes, a master of the social transaction. They were a perfect, hollow team. Then came the moment. Leo's new boss, a man with a booming voice and a self-satisfied air, raised his glass for a toast. He lauded Leo's forward-thinking vision. Then Charlotte took the floor. She raised her champagne flute, the silver sequins on her dress catching the light. "To my brilliant husband Leo," she began, her voice ringing with practiced sincerity, "who understands that in life, as in business, you cannot be afraid to leverage your assets for future growth. To the future." "To the future," the crowd echoed. As the applause died down, a man in a black chef's coat, the catering manager, approached Charlotte. He leaned in and spoke in a low voice, but in the sudden lull, his words carried. "Ma'am," he said, his voice apologetic but firm, "the card was declined." A ripple of silence spread from the center of the room. Charlotte's face, which had been glowing with triumph, went utterly pale. "What? That's impossible," she hissed, fumbling in her tiny, glittering purse. "Try it again." "We have, ma'am," the manager said, clearly uncomfortable. "And the second one as well. Perhaps you have another form of payment." All eyes were on her. The perfect hostess, the woman of effortless wealth, was being publicly undone by a credit card machine. The air was thick with a delicious, horrified silence. Her carefully constructed world was cracking right down the middle. And into that silence I stepped forward. "Perhaps I can help," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Every head turned toward me. Charlotte stared, her mouth slightly agape. Leo looked as if he was going to be physically ill. I walked to the glass coffee table in the center of the room, the silent epicenter of the party. I was no longer a ghost. I was the most solid thing in the room. My voice came out differently. It was no longer the voice of a woman asking permission to exist. It was clear, calm, and carried the weight of 40 years of silence. "Charlotte," I said, looking directly at her, "you just mentioned leveraging assets. An interesting choice of words." I let that hang in the air for a beat. Then I turned my gaze to my son. "Leo, you told me I was too old to keep my house, that it was a burden, a piece of dead money." I reached into my canvas tote bag. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the fabric. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a summary I had prepared with Mr. Davies. "For the past 5 years," I said, my voice resonating in the tomb-like quiet, "I have given you and your wife $322,000. A collective gasp went through the room. "That figure includes $50,000 for your wedding. It includes $75,000 for a failed business venture. And it includes $150,000 for the down payment on this condominium." I paused, letting the weight of the numbers settle. "That $150,000 was your father's life insurance policy. It was the money he left to ensure that I would have, in his words, peace of mind in my old age." Charlotte's face had drained of all color. She looked like a statue carved from ice. "But you were right," I continued, my voice softening into an almost conversational tone. "It is important to understand one's assets." I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out the heavy blue folder. I placed it on the glass coffee table. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that seemed to echo in the silent room. "This," I said, "was left to me by my late husband, Robert. As you know, he was a history professor. What you didn't know is that his hobby, his quiet study of market cycles, was rather more successful than anyone imagined." I looked from Charlotte's stunned face to Leo's ashen one. "Mr. Davies, his lawyer, helped me to understand its contents this week. It turns out Robert didn't just leave me a house, he left me a fortress." I patted the blue folder. "Among other things, the Vance Family Trust, of which I am the sole trustee, owns this building, this one and 2 others in the city." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical presence, pressing in on all sides, sucking the air out of the room. The caterer, the boss, the socialites, they were all frozen, staring first at the shabby old woman in the gray dress, then at the blue folder, then at the crumbling faces of their hosts. I looked at Charlotte, at the ruins of her perfect party, at the terror in her eyes. The fortress she had built against humiliation had just been leveled, and the architect of her destruction was the one person she had never, ever considered a threat. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a near whisper that everyone in the room strained to hear. "You were right, Charlotte. It's all about asset management." I met her eyes. "I'm just re-evaluating which assets are performing." Then I turned, picked up my canvas tote, and walked away. I did not look back. I walked through the silent, parted crowd, my sensible heels making no sound on the thick rug. I walked out of their apartment, out of their lives, and I didn't look back. The profound, ringing silence followed me all the way to the elevator. I stepped out of the Lux